I thought she'd have been very good.
We will wrap up. You earned it, right?
That's interesting. Now, sources of water.
Good evening. We're going to get started. We all set? Let's settle down, folks. Settle down. Okay. Susan Scorbati is running just a few minutes late, so I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming you all this evening to Kappa and introducing you to our guest. For those of you I don't know, I do see a few new faces. I'm Brian Campy, and I'm the Director of Public Policy Programs here at the Center for the Advancement of Public Action. I also serve as one of the 2 state senators with Senator Sears for Bennington County and Wilmington. I do, and I mean this absolutely sincerely, have the distinct pleasure of introducing our Lieutenant Governor, David Zuckerman, this evening. Let me tell you a little bit about David. David is the co-founder of Full Moon Farm, a NOFA-certified organic farm in Hinesburg, Vermont. Prior to being elected our lieutenant governor, David served for 14 years in the Vermont House of Representatives, representing the city of Burlington in the Chittenden 3-4 district. He served on the Natural Resources and Energy Committee and Agriculture Committee and Ways and Means Committee. David's leadership spans many, many, many issues, including renewable energy, affordable housing, livable wages, cannabis reform, GMO legislation, universal health care, progressive taxation, marriage equality, and end-of-life choices. David served in the Vermont Senate as a progressive Democrat since his election in 2012, where I had the honor of serving with him in Senate Education. In 2016, David was elected the 80th Lieutenant Governor of the state of Vermont. David is a UVM graduate with a degree in environmental studies, and he lives with his wife Rachel and daughter on their farm in Hinesburg. On the most personal of notes, there are, I think, people who sometimes will, of course, with any politician, agree and disagree with politicians. But one thing is true with David, and I believe all of my colleagues would agree, that David has worked incredibly hard for economic equity, equal rights, and supporting Vermont's most vulnerable population. So for that, and with that, I hope you will once again join me in welcoming our Lieutenant Governor, David Zuckerman.
Thank you.
My pleasure. So this evening we're talking about how to have a voice in democracy. And David has, as some students who just met with him before this, had the unique opportunity of talking with him around how to get hard things done. And David has worked on some incredibly challenging legislation over the years. And so I thought we would just kick it off by David sharing a little bit around how he's done those kinds of things, strategy, introducing bills, sometimes over and over again. But I thought we would just talk for a moment about end-of-life choices, since that came up during our dinner. If you would just tell us a little bit about that legislation that Vermont ended up signing eventually, but your initial role in getting that going and your work on that.
Sure. It's interesting that issue came to me via some advocates in Chittenden County. And as advocates, what I mean is citizens who cared about something. So any one of you could be an advocate if at some point you care about something and you call your legislator and you tell them about it. You have now become an advocate. You may even become a community organizer if you talk to one friend and ask them to make a phone call, then suddenly you're actually a community organizer with all the baggage that may or may not come with. But I think it's a tremendous benefit to society if you become either an advocate for something you care about or become part of some issue that you or others care about. And so an individual came to me, and he was originally asking me sort of, so how does this happen, and how long do you think it will take? And
What is that again? Remind folks what that
end-of-life choices?
Yeah, tell just a little.
So for one thing, in the political arena, almost every word you hear has been thought about. So end-of-life choices was not the original language that was even used around this issue. It was death with dignity. It's been end-of-life choices. It's been, some people call it physician-assisted suicide. Depending on where you stand on an issue, sometimes the terminology that you use with that issue, you're using to help frame the debate and the discussion. And so even as you're working on an issue, sometimes for years on end, you find there's a different way to frame the issue that makes it something people can hear in a way that they couldn't hear it before when it had a different title to it. And so this issue had to do with an individual as they are nearing the end of their life with a terminal illness. The idea was to give them more autonomy over that last moment in their life, and that it is something that they could control if they wanted to, but also something that not everybody wants to control, or not everybody wants someone telling them how to control it. And so it was about choice, which typically is a word people feel comfortable with the idea of choice. I want to have choices in my life. We want to have choices in school. We want to have choices in partners. We want to have choice in the flavor of coffee we drink. Choice is a word that we feel very comfortable with. So this gentleman came to me and asked about what it would take, and I said, I think it's going to take 6 to 10 years. And he said, oh. It was a little bit of a shock, because he thought, oh, well, the people I know support this, so why wouldn't this just be something that is a piece of cake? We want to give people choice. What's the big deal? Well, when you go into certain arenas that particularly go to the core of people's ethical beliefs and value systems, that is delicate waters in the world of politics and policymaking and change. And it takes time, because those conversations have to happen. People want to have those conversations. They want to think on those conversations. They want to have it with another person, reflect. And sometimes when they're big and somewhat going to be controversial, you also then immediately have typically an adversary that will also be organizing. And anytime you start having two sides and we get somewhat tribal in the world of politics, you could think parties, for instance. You could think different positions on issues. There are times when that tribalism itself makes inertia the reality. And so I did say to him I'd be more than happy to help lead that effort and introduce legislation. There had been legislation introduced in the 90s, but it had not been taken up particularly seriously. And we talked about what does it take to get an issue that is not one of the top issues. Economics and jobs, housing and economic justice. Those sorts of things are somewhat perennial issues, and we're always trying to figure out how to do that. But on the social issues or issues that aren't in that top tier, it takes time to build an effort. And I talked about organizing, building a constituency across the state, thinking about who the legislators might be that would be critical supporters in different positions on certain committees or political influence, and So we sort of had that conversation, and he went home and had to think long and hard because he thought, oh, if I bring this up, we can fight for a couple of years, we can win, and I can go back to, he happened to have a sailboat and was enjoying sailing as his years were coming on. And it actually took 10 years, I believe, 9 or 10 years to pass, if you want to get into the detail. And it did pass before he passed on. But there were a number of people who were advocating for it who actually passed away before the law went into effect. He did ultimately, I believe, actually utilize the law, which was sort of an interesting full circle aspect. That is not often the way some laws happen. Some laws do create an incredibly personal effect for people. And that's one of them, that you see that tangible difference. And as a legislator, sometimes we work on lots of laws. We pass many laws every year that you don't really know the individual that it's going to change the world for. But other times you work on legislation that, excuse me, you know does directly impact people you know, and sometimes they tell you. And that's one of the rewards of the job we do, amongst the things that you sometimes hear and see in the world of politics, which is that, why would you ever do that? All you get is grief. You're always terrible. You're destroying the world. You're unethical. Politicians are creeps. The word politician has a negative ring and tone to it at this point. We could get into how that's happened. But it's those individuals that once in a while come back to you 6 years, 10 years, 12 years later and say, you know, you did this back in 2005, and it impacted me or my family member or a friend in some way. Thank you. And that pretty well makes up for weeks or years of the other piece of what you typically see in politics, in the media, and in campaigning. But it can be a very satisfying opportunity to serve.
So I'm only going into my 5th term. You've had a much longer stretch up there, both in the House
because I'm so much older than you are.
Senate. David is significantly older than I am. No, actually, I think I have David. But now you're as a lieutenant governor, and I think most people in the audience have a okay understanding of what a House member, Senate, the daily routine. I mean, a little bit. They're there to make laws. They know how to reach out. Would you tell us a little bit about the role of the lieutenant governor, how it works, and also a little bit how you have influence?
Sure. A couple different things. One is you don't really know what it's like to be lieutenant governor until you are one. I will state that for sure. There's each of these roles that we have in elected office in some ways has much more of an image of power than the power that actually exists. And I probably shouldn't tell you that. Brian doesn't want you to know that. It's sort of, well, you're in this position of power, make this thing happen. And so people look to you and say, look, we elected you to do this, now do it. You have power, look, you're this important person. And the reality is that we are only as important and as powerful as the voice that you give us. And as lieutenant governor, it's a curious position because you're somewhat the administration, but you also have one foot still in the legislature. So obviously, sort of U.S. History 101, you've got the legislative branch, the administrative branch, and the judicial branch. And lieutenant governor is a little bit in between two of those, which is not how you think of it. It's these 3 co-equal branches. And so serving as lieutenant governor, I think each person has to find what that voice and that power, which is an interesting word, is. And in many respects, the technical, most primary job that you do is you preside over the Senate as essentially the town moderator at a town meeting that happens 4 days of the week for 4 months of the year. And you actually don't voice your position on issues while you're that town moderator, which I'm sure those of you who attend town meetings throughout your local towns here know it's the parliamentarian. And there's some wiggle room in rulings on amendments or pieces of language that are trying to be added to other bills as to whether or not they are allowed to be debated or not allowed to be debated because they're related or they're not related. And there's a little wiggle room on what is germane in that respect or not. But for me, as I entered the office, I thought that it would really give me an opportunity to expand upon something I had been doing as a representative and a senator, which I think everybody does to their own extent as elected officers in their communities. But I had done in a little bit broader way than a fair number of my colleagues in being an organizer where I thought the power was outside the building, not inside the building. And so I have worked as lieutenant governor to continue when I'm not moderating the Senate for that hour to 2 hours a day, actually really focusing outward and working to communicate with people all over the state to empower you with how you can influence what's going on in the building. And as a brief example of that, I would just say that House members, and there's a former or current House member who is now retiring, by the way, Bill Botso, who should be given a shout out, who's here tonight. Tell me if I'm wrong, and former House member as well, that you don't actually hear from your constituents as much as most of you would think you do. You do hear from constituents on the big issues that are in the media or that an advocacy organization sends out the email. Is anybody here a member of an organization that sends you emails and alerts about a topic? Raise your hand, right? So you get that email and they say, click here to send an email to your legislator, and an email goes off to the legislator, and Representative Botso or Senator Campion gets 32 emails within a 1 to 2 day period that say the same thing with your name and address at the bottom. And that's important to do, especially because that address is there, and if they're a constituent, it matters, no doubt about it. But we also know that those are these sort of mass-produced scenarios versus the individual email. If someone sits down on a topic that you know an email didn't go out about, and you've sat down and you've said to someone, you know, I really care about, and here's why. Whether it's an email, a phone call, or a handwritten letter, that has a little more weight to it than the ones that are sort of easy to hit click. And the reality is you don't get very many of those as a legislator. You get very, very few. And so if I can help get 3 or 5 or 7 communications to various legislators through my organizing around the state, that is actually how I would feel I have more influence than almost any other way. Certainly, I'm also a mouthpiece with a soapbox that as lieutenant governor, that box is bigger than most others in the state. But even still, as lieutenant governor, it's actually, they go to the governor and they go to the leadership of the House and Senate on most issues, and I'm in this like not their zone. So I have to make the bubble for people to hear what I'm saying.
So there are some students here in a class with me called Activating Democracy, where we're looking at how to work within a legislative body effectively. And you've been talking about some of those kinds of things around correspondence and around grassroots. But I want to go back to something, and I'm not sure if I heard you correctly. Where is the power? Did you say you really believe it's outside the building, it's inside the building? Is it, tell us a little bit more about that relationship and talk a little bit about power itself, because I think power sometimes people think, it's a big part of this. It's whether you're a constituent or an elected official to sort of advance things. And so tell us a little bit about that.
So the first thing that comes to mind for me as to where the power is that the power is in our hearts and in our minds. That's where it comes from initially. There's political power, and I think that's what you're talking about, and I will address that. But I just want to remind everybody that sometimes we start within a paradigm and a mindset, and we forget really where the power is. And in democracy, it's in the people, and it's in the hearts and the minds of the people. And it's in the minds in terms of fact and reality and debating of the facts, which is a key word in this day and age. And it's in the hearts as well, because those that put their heart and their passion and their souls into changing our policies and our communities for, one would hope, for the better. If you've got that drive and that passion for sort of that infinite goal of betterment, and you continue to use that, you will end up with more power and more voice than many other folks who don't use their hearts and their minds to engage in the system. Now, to what your question really was.
But no, I do think that's part of it. I think you're right. If you have people, we all know that people who are going to work really particularly hard on an issue and want to advance it. I mean, that's recognized. That's part of a way to obtain power and use it.
Well, and I think some of that happens as you speak out more, sometimes with risk. There is risk to speaking out. Someone will disagree with you. Someone may even point their finger at you. Someone may even say bad things about you because they disagree, and their heart and their mind comes from a different perspective. So there is risk. But when you speak out, often others who have been afraid to do so will then call you or go to that local library or coffee shop where you're having an event, and that voice will grow. I remember actually growing up a song that was played regularly, and my parents were not hippies by any means, but Alice's Restaurant was a song that my older sisters, who were of the right age, played a lot. And if one person does it, one person walks into a bar goes into a restaurant singing a bar of Alice's Restaurant, they'll think you're crazy and they'll throw you out. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Some of the younger folks don't, but you can Google it. And you can listen to this song. It's a long song. It's a story. If two people walk into a restaurant and sing a bar of Alice's Restaurant, they'll think you're both crazy, and they'll throw you both out. He said, but if 50 people walk into a bar and walk into a restaurant, sing a bar of Alice's Restaurant, and walk out, they'll think it's a movement. Imagine, and he goes on, imagine 50 people a day doing this. And so that's what happens when one person sticks their neck out. They think you're crazy. But at some point, if you know other people think that same way, you will give them the empowerment to also step forward and speak up. And as more and more do so, that's where that people power comes from. And we are very lucky in Vermont that that's actually still the way it is. Now, that power conflicts with other elements of power in the political system. Within the political system, folks who have seniority and have been in the political process for a while eventually get to different positions of power. Chairs of committees, leadership of parties, leadership of a chamber, president pro tem, speaker of the House, governor. These positions do carry power because those folks have been people that stick their neck out in a similar way and have been elected and been given that power by the vote of the people.
And so they have statute that they're allowed to execute.
Right, absolutely. So there's the nuts and bolts of that of statutory power, but you also end up with sort of political capital, which is this ball of energy that is undescribed and undefined. And in some cases, that can be larger and smaller just by how you carry yourself and hold that position and how you walk through a room and what gender you are and what the color of your skin is. So there are elements that you can shape that power, and there are elements in which that power is shaped for you by societal norms. Yeah. And we are working to change some of those. But in terms of institutional power, I think some of that comes from experience and understanding how far you can go in that moment in time with where is the public, where are your colleagues, how far can we push this issue? And you start to learn that and sense that when you've been through more and more years of service in these arenas, because you've experienced where you pushed too far and lost, and it set you back. And other times where you pushed a little farther than other people thought you could go, and you actually win. And so, the the power rests in so many different factors that come together, and some are completely out of your control. And sometimes it's just dumb luck. I pinch myself regularly and go, what made me be the person or a person who has said, this is the right thing to do, or we should go forward on this issue, when at the moment that I did that, it maybe certainly wasn't where the majority of my political colleagues were, and maybe was or wasn't where the general population was, but it's where the general population was headed. I honestly don't know why that has occurred, and I wonder all the time what created that. You know, I was introducing legislation around GMOs in 1999. We did pass a law in 2006 that got vetoed, and then we passed GMO labeling in 2014. 14
when did
years
you enter
later.
it? 14
1999 was when I first introduced a package of different legislation.
Did you see momentum building all the way along that would encourage you to think, okay, you are gaining momentum, you're gaining power, people are actually starting to believe in this?
I did, and in part, I also legislated differently. I think I talked earlier about being an organizer.
Mm-hmm.
I went to, other folks were talking about this issue around the state, and Vermont's a very small state, so you instantly learn about Susan Davidson in Middlebury, and Peter Cooper and others in Brattleboro, and you go meet with them, and then they invite you down as a legislator leading the issue for a coffee hour or an evening event, and 12 people come. And then you do it again 6 months later, and 22 people come. And as a legislator from Burlington, to drive to Middlebury and to drive to Brattleboro, that's not as common amongst what most legislators do. You work within your district, and you maybe have those meetings in your district. But I was an organizer in my soul, and I cared about these issues beyond my district did too, but beyond my job is to represent my district. We are part of a body making laws for the state, and there are people outside my district that also care. And when you do that traveling, A, other people are honored by that you've traveled there, and B, you develop this network across the state. And so we did actually pass a law that would require seed sales, GMO seed sales, to be reported annually by the seed distributors in the state. So we had a track record, I think it was from 2001 or 2 on, of the percentage of seeds sold in Vermont, percentage of corn, percentage of soy, percentage of others that were GMO versus non-GMO. And over time, we saw the curve change. We were the only state to ever pass that law, and it has since now been nullified when the federal government not only threw out our GMO labeling law, they actually said, and all these other laws get thrown out too. It was really quite disheartening to see so many years of effort, success building on success, constituent growing across the state. You know, we passed the labeling law. We passed a law in 2006 that was to require the seed manufacturers to bear the economic and environmental liability of GMOs, not the farmer next door that planted it versus the farmer that didn't want that contamination. The governor vetoed that. Then Douglas was the governor. But still, momentum was building. We were passing significant law. And then 2014 labeling law, and in 2016, 3 weeks after it went into effect, after about $120 million of lobbying at the federal level, all of those laws were turned into Swiss cheese by the federal government. So that particular bill and topic, I've seen it from beginning to growth with defeat, to ultimate victory, to ultimate defeat. It's a roller coaster, let me tell you.
But nonetheless, it had a huge federal impact that was entirely disproportional to Vermont's.
That's a good point, and thank you for chiming in on that. For those that didn't hear, maybe in the back, he said, but nonetheless, it had a tremendous impact. And in fact, there are companies today that continue to use the labeling terminology that we put into place. And in fact, in Washington, even with the new GMO labeling law, that would allow that wording to not exist. There are companies continuing to do so because they have found that people do want to know that. And in some instances, people are now more okay with GMOs than less with that labeling on there because they're realizing they've eaten that food for so long and they don't think that anything's happened to them yet because of it. And on the other hand, it's given information to people who have been able to make that decision. So it has continued to have an effect. So I appreciate that because that's true.
So there are many students here who are required to be here. and which is great. And so, and I'm hoping they have some good questions to get the conversation going a little bit. If not, I have another one, but it doesn't have to be a student. Yes.
I just would like you to talk a little more about just environmental, like, so you did the GMOs. Have you done any other, I know you talked earlier about like more environmental things.
Sure.
And you also live on a farm, and I think that's really cool. But could you talk more about just like environmental policies and legislation?
Sure, I'd be happy to. In fact, my initial major in college was chemistry with a minor in environmental studies, and it was during that coursework in environmental studies that I became aware of truly the environmental impact of agriculture and where our food comes from. And we talk a lot about transportation, but when it comes to water quality and climate change, agriculture has a very, very large footprint. And the food we choose to buy every day, some with more ability to choose than others, and we have to be aware and fair to people that don't have the economic means to make some of those choices. But the food we eat every day, just like every other choice that we make in terms of how we spend our dollars, has profound impacts on climate change in particular, water quality, and soil health, which ultimately all come back to our own human health if we want to make it about us, which I hope people think about more than themselves. But we do have a tendency to first think about ourselves. And I switched those majors after working in chemistry labs quite a bit, thinking I wanted to be a doctor. My dad was a doctor. And I had taken a year off because I'd been so active on campus. I helped organize Earth Day in 1990. In the spring of 90, it was the 20th anniversary of Earth Day. And I realized I was more of an activist than I was student. And for those of you who are aware of what college costs, which I think here at Bennington folks may be, but UVM's right up there in the out-of-state expense scenario as well. I realized I was doing more outside the classroom than in. It was quite a bit of money that my parents and my ancestors helped make an opportunity for me. Took a year off and I hiked the Appalachian Trail. And when I returned to school a year later, I flipped my majors to an environmental studies major. So I came into activism through the environmental lens. And it was Bernie in 1992 that inspired me in the political arena, because frankly, I was, as many young people are, quite cynical about corporate money in politics. This was back in 1992, mind you. It's not exactly improved. And there was this person who didn't take corporate money, who wore his politics on his sleeve, was independent of the two corporate parties. That was my lens. And he sort of turned me on to politics. But serving my first term, I had a choice of a couple committees in the end that the speaker had given me, and I wanted to be and was on the Natural Resources and Energy Committee for the first 4 years, and did a lot of work around renewable energy. Climate change was being discussed then by some people. Unfortunately, we were not as successful either at the state level or obviously at the federal level to have averted the catastrophe that we're now living through. But moving towards, for instance, zoning regulations. I said, under our Development Control Law, Act 250, why don't we reduce some of the hurdles if we build denser housing in town, villages, and city centers, and aim for denser housing rather than sprawl, which some might not realize, but that's an incredibly energy important concept. And throughout many years have worked to support solar energy, wind energy. The last number of years, there's been a lot of discussion in Vermont about the siting of solar and wind, and I think there's a fairly large solar field just up the road here that had some controversy to it. I think the majority support it, but maybe I just lost a bunch of votes in this room next time around. I don't know. But to me, I see those solar panel fields and those wind turbines as an inkling of hope that my daughter, who just turned 13 yesterday, so anybody wants to give me advice on that after the show, let me know. It's always been a show, isn't it? that those represent an inkling of hope,
Yeah.
that there's going to be a planet that will be sustainable enough for people to live on at the populations we have over the course of her lifetime. Because if you actually, I'm going to go off for a minute.
No, sure, yeah.
When we look at wars around the world, and in particular, if we look at refugees around the world, last February, and I'm sure we'll have a new number this February, but last February on World Refugee Day, there were approximately 64 million refugees around the world. When you actually fundamentally look at the cause, and you dig deeper than religious conflict and societal, tribal conflict, it fundamentally comes down to natural resources. And the most fundamental of natural resources are clean food and water and the ability to produce food, which we've lost track of in this country because you can go to the store and buy food anytime and it's there. But in most of the world, that food security is not remotely like what it is here in terms of accessibility and quantity. And with climate change, the ability to grow food or live on the coast where you go out and you harvest food from the oceans, people are getting displaced by rising tides, by drought, by flooding and too much rain, and they are moving because there is no food and there is no safe place to live. And so when I see solar panels and wind turbines, and I'm debating those issues either on the floor when I was in the chambers or in the media and through any other place I can talk about these things, I remind ourselves, I try to remind us that some of the issues we're fighting about around panels and turbines and what it looks like means we are speaking about these things from such a place of privilege and such disregard for the incredible disruption of climate change on people right now. And the way that we exploit now in politics and don't even recognize that refugees anywhere in the world, including coming through Central America, when you fundamentally go back down to the natural resources, changing them into violent criminals or threats to us is just beyond me, which is a tangent again, but I just can't help it in this world of fact, which I mentioned the importance of that word earlier. So I went off a bit on the environment, but it's incredibly important to me.
We may go back to the environment, but I do want to just switch gears for 1 second because I think you touched on it a little bit, and that's how to fund elections. And it goes back to one of the reasons we have you here is to talk about having one's voice in a democracy. Could you talk a little bit about your thoughts and even your own personal experiences around funding elections and public funding?
Okay, well, first, I brought some envelopes to just kidding. It's remarkably, we are very fortunate here in Vermont in that we don't have to fundraise every single day to run for office. But I think a lot of people were inspired by Beto O'Rourke running in Texas, talking about the fact that when he was first elected as a representative in Texas, one of the first things he got at orientation as a new congressperson was a term called call time, which is actually something that most representatives and senators do every single day that they're in Washington. And not for 20 minutes, but for 1, 2, 4, 5 hours a day. And that is calling people or corporations or PACs for money. Because you don't raise $500,000 or $2 million or $20 million in the short window of a few months of a campaign. And it is the fundamental core corrupting element of politics. Because if you're spending 2, 3, or 5 hours a day raising money, when are you sitting down reading the issues, talking to your colleagues, communicating with your constituents directly as opposed to through a staff person, to really be working on the issues. And if you have to raise that sum of money, subconsciously, it starts to affect your decision making. Because if you know that going this direction on an issue is going to reduce your access to some of those resources, you may slightly shift over time. I don't think anybody goes down to Washington thinking I'm just going to be someone who's a spokesperson for this particular amount of money. You go there because you care about the issues that you campaigned about. So often the lining up of the money with who you are sort of does happen naturally. Although there are some major corporations and views out there that equally give the money to all sides, knowing that they need the money, and therefore, when you call to meet with them in the office, they're going to say, oh yeah, I'd be happy to meet with you. Because they know that 6 months later, you're going to be calling them again. And so money, if you were to take every single issue, we could talk about 30 issues today. I would say the most fundamental issue that has to be changed to return politics to the democracy it's supposed to be is changing how campaigns are funded. It's as fundamental as that. Nothing else will be addressed with an untainted debate until the money changes. Now, it's very hard. And I now have a much more nuanced and somewhat accepting stand than I had when I spoke about what I viewed it as back in 1992 as a student that said the two corporate parties. Okay? Because the bottom line is, if one side, quote, disarms, then you're fighting a battle of a fire hydrant hose against a squirt gun, and you will lose. Game over. And so the Democratic Party, while more people within the Democratic Party would eschew corporate money, you can't just unilaterally disarm. Or you couldn't. I would argue we're getting closer to the point when one could. Bernie's campaign obviously shocked the political establishment. Shocked it. Beto O'Rourke has taken that to another level, not only non-corporate, but no PACs at all. Shocking. Now, he also had the best opponent one could buy to help have people go, I want to help you, not only because you're charismatic and you're smart and you're articulate, but oh my God, right? So, so sometimes it's circumstantial. Back to why have I picked certain issues? How did Beto end up being the opponent to Cruz after we all learned more about him when he ran for president, right? So some of these things are just dumb luck and timing. But I actually am a member as a progressive / Democrat of the Democratic Lieutenant Governors Association, which actually was an organization that had stopped existing a few years back because A, there were so few, and B, there's only a few races in the state where the candidates for governor and lieutenant governor run independent races. And so there wasn't a lot of money for the organization, it didn't stop existing, et cetera. Well, a year ago, it was reconstituted, and they found the bank account that still had $225,000 in it, which is a lot of money to any of us, but for a nationwide political organization, that's not a lot of money. When you think about the Republican Congressional Committee and the Democratic Congressional Committees that raise tens, if not now three-figure millions of dollars in a cycle. And so at our meeting, literally a week ago, one of the first of the meetings that's existed of this organization again, I said, if our goal is $500,000, maybe even $1 million a year, what if we were to be the first Democratic Party organization to say we will go corporate free? Because I think the risk is there, but the organization didn't even exist 2 years ago. I didn't have any money from it 2 years ago helping me out. This time they supported me with $5,000. Most candidates across the country for lieutenant governor as Democrats or as part of a team of governor and lieutenant got almost no support or non-existent support. So the risk is we're back where we were. But the reward with the general population thinking about corporate money in politics as they are, and this is true across the political spectrum, would be huge. And I happen to think the reward for the Democratic Party, who has had to walk a very knife edge, high wire act of we don't support corporate money in politics, but we take corporate money because we have to, which is a pretty full mouthful for most people out there to accept as a reality. And it goes, politicians talking out of both sides of their mouth, how unusual, right? It doesn't really play that well. But it's a reality that unfortunately has to be stated, and it's true. So I don't begrudge Democratic bigwigs that do that. But it could be an opportunity for the Democratic Party to say, one of our nationwide organizations is trying to go down that path. You show us that we can continue to do that, and maybe we can go to the next organization that has to raise more, and the next one that has to raise more. Now, admittedly, when I first brought this up a week ago, it was a fairly tepid response. But in case you haven't noticed, I'm a little tenacious. I play long ball, and I'm going to continue to work on it. And in fact, 3 days later, when I was at the Sanders Institute, talking with some alternative media folks and some other social progressive leaders in this country, I said, what do you think of this idea, and could you help me get this ball rolling? And if I have to get social media and alternative media to put this out there and point out that if people could call their Democratic lieutenant governors to support this idea and put pressure on them from the outside, which I think I've talked about, I think it's an opportunity. As I said, with 23 lieutenant governors, if each of us committed to raising $10,000, which especially if you're from Illinois, California, New York, I would think you ought to be able to find either 10 $1,000 individual donors or 20 $500 donors or 50 $200 donors to do that. We'd already be $230,000 to $250,000 away there. And if we could get a Bernie Sanders or a Beto to send out their infamous emails, and if we could get some national media for it, and John Oliver started talking about it, $1 million actually is not a lot of money. So that's my corporate money in politics, and I'm going to stick to it.
Great.
So I've been to a lot of these talks, and I've heard a lot of different Vermont governors or legislators talk, and I'm just wondering how special is Vermont in the sense that it's so small, and so there's a lot of accessibility for constituents to their elected representatives, and so I'm wondering how much a lot of the optimism, I guess, around that accessibility can apply to other larger states.
Great question. And my friend Peter Carmoli, who drove me down, I'm going to say this just to get his goat, but we're very uniquely special. That was a joke on words, and I'm glad most of you got it. There's no such thing as very unique. Unique is unique. No. I think Vermont is actually fairly exceptional. The access that you have to reach us is really quite remarkable. And I was at a table at Stratton a couple days ago, and the person who had been driving with me that day had met a couple from New Jersey who was thinking about moving here in their retirement. And they said to him, why should we move to Vermont? I mean, we like it here, it's beautiful. I mean, they're at Stratton and you're looking at these mountains and snow. And he said, well, most people in Vermont that I know have met either Peter Welch, Bernie Sanders, Senator Leahy, certainly their local representatives, and the community sense that we have and the access to your elected leaders. And then I had brought my plate of food over to the table, and he said, for instance, you're sitting at the table with the lieutenant governor. And they were like, that's pretty curious. So it's not just that you can pick up the phone or send an email. If you actually pick up the phone and call your legislator they would probably be happy to have a cup of coffee or tea with you. That is just not true in those larger states. And that won't happen and is not replicable. So some of what we have can't apply. On the other hand, what Vermont has and every other state has are coalitions, organizations, the 50 people a day, not you're by yourself situation, where you can engage in the political process. And over time, if we truly believe in democracy, and I know we're kind of questioning that right now, at least some of us are, but I fundamentally believe in the power of the institution to withstand the current onslaught. And I think we're already seeing in this last election the fact that the public believes that, and the shift back is coming. And the silver lining of this very dark cloud, which will dump a lot of rain and will have long-lasting ramifications, particularly on the courts. But that the people of this nation, big state or small, fundamentally, I think have been reawoken to the importance of participation. And I think back to how we take food access somewhat for granted, especially those of us that have the time to be here tonight, or the resources to attend universities and colleges, who have taken sometimes some of these incredible societal planetary luxuries for granted, are waking up. That if we just go through life with the enjoyments that we have and don't fundamentally engage in our communities, in our democracy, then we will suffer. And we did that 2 years ago. And, but I think what we're seeing is around the country, people are going, oh, how do I engage? How do I participate? Not just in voting every 2 years for state or federal office. Oh yeah, there's local office too. And who are these organizations that will help summarize environmental issues, individual rights issues, whatever you care about? I can guarantee you there's an organization out there of people that also care about it. And people right now, through the access that you have to information, through these little gadgets, are engaging in the process. And I think that can happen in every scale state that's out there. And if you look at that, frankly, all the way to the scale of Texas, it's clear that for anybody who doesn't think this, we could debate it, but Texas was a massive, massive victory. Victory is not won and lost in a single election. The fact that the Republican Party has to pour tens of millions of dollars into Texas meant that many fewer resources for all of those House races in other parts of the country. As much as it's somewhat unlimited resources on the other side, on all sides, the money in the wealthy arena is huge. They still will only put so much in. And the fact that Texas and Georgia and Florida, 3 of the biggest states in the country, just had the outcomes they had is actually a tremendous success. And one that 2 years from now and 4 years from now, we will recognize far more than some recognize right now. And it's something, if we think about it as an election is finite, we will lose.
Similar to you continuing to put certain legislation in. If you thought
Sure.
that was the one and only
Introduce
time,
it this year, yeah.
and that was it, but this continuing. All right, some additional questions. Yes, Jorge.
I'm so glad that you spoke about the cooperation, but I am wondering, again, coming back to the 21st century, do you think is it the cooperation companies that controls the behavior of the states, or it's the people? Because today, like the way, like it says what our countries can do, like we can't afford like 17 years
Sadly, I do think that corporate influence, it sometimes is direct issue by issue and the contributions and the power. But I think it's a broader overarching umbrella of power. And certainly with the military-industrial complex, they have strategically installed either manufacturing plants or military bases, et cetera, over time in every single congressional district in the country. That was a strategy because it is often talked about that that military base or that military weapons production facility is good paying jobs. And so if you're against the military, not only are you unpatriotic, but you want to eliminate jobs in your community. That has been an insidious change over 60 years that we were warned about. I believe it was Eisenhower, right? Right? And so this influence is something that is power creep over time. And the reality happens in so many different ways. So if you have money to influence the system, not only is it through the contributions, but it's also through having representation in the building. Again, Representative, Senator, and I, we know dozens, and there's hundreds of people who are lobbyists in the State House of Montpelier. And they are paid to be there. They are either paid by individual corporations, associations of corporations, associations of citizens who care about particular issues. So they're not all corporate necessarily. It's anybody with larger resources or lots of little resources pooled together, right? It's the organized with the one big fish and then the lots of little fish that make a bigger jaw. People familiar with that painting, art piece? So it happens from all sides, but it takes a lot more work to get 500 little fish to be together against one big fish, and versus a check where Pfizer and pharmaceutical industries and hospital associations and others and insurance companies who make a lot of money. For them, the investment to keep the system the way it is a drop in the bucket. So it influences us tremendously. I want to say before the next question, because one person is left and I hate to let someone go. If you want that little newsletter I was talking about, I'm going to pass this clipboard around and you can sign up. And it's sometimes topics I was saying to Brian and others before that I've offered to folks who are on different perspectives of issues to put the two different, there's often more than two, but we think bipolar, each of their, get a paragraph, put links to your source of information, and let the Vermonters go into a deeper depth on an issue. If you could take this and we'll pass it around the front and then around the back, if you want it. It's electronic, no paper involved, although we will mail you one if you don't do electronic. Put your mailing address. The delete key is very easy to use if it's not a topic you're interested in.
Okay. Let's, sorry. No, I only have about 20 minutes or so, so yes, go ahead.
thoughts you
Yeah.
might have in terms of like dealing with those issues?
Yeah, important, great question and topic. A couple things. One is I'm actually really curious to hear the thought that today there's a feeling of powerlessness and apathy when, in fact, we just had the largest midterm voter turnout in this country since, I believe, the 60s or even the 40s.
Yeah, that's why
And
I said kind of the last year, I was like, it's been getting, I've noticed it getting better.
oh, better. I heard it as the other way. I'm sorry. I thought you said
Like,
there's
up
growing.
until then,
That's right. Okay. Sorry, I misheard you.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of factors that go into that apathy depending on who the person is and their circumstances. I think a lot of very comfortable people sort of didn't need to be engaged, and so they weren't. And when this last election happened, it became a wake-up call that, oh, the system doesn't function well automatically. So for some, I think that was a wake-up call. For others, I think the wake-up call was not from a position of comfort, where in fact, even still, some people are going to move along just fine with some of the changes that were made. But depending where you are on the issue of choice and women's reproductive freedom, I think there was a wake-up call, particularly for women, but equally important for men who actually can think outside of themselves to engage. The threats and fear, sometimes I think what happens in politics is we, and I speak of myself as one of 7,500 elected people in the country at the state and federal level, can be a bit hyperbolic at times with our words. And so the world's always about to end, and this issue is always about to happen in a certain way. And so it becomes a never cry wolf situation where folks just go, oh, you're just screaming the same stuff again. But I think this election sort of, whoa. You know, some have been screaming it for a while. So I think that has changed some of it. In terms of bringing those who are more vulnerable or less empowered into this process, I think that's incumbent on all of us who are more empowered to do that work. Certainly, as a white, male, cis, financially stable, in a position of power, there's an incredible need for people like me to make sure the door is open and people are invited in, and that's metaphorically because not everyone can transport, obviously, so I don't mean it physically. And some of what I'm trying to do with that newsletter, because it can get to your home and can give you more information and give you the links on how to find out the phone numbers and emails of your legislators. There are organizations out there organizing in all new ways, from Rights and Democracy to indivisible groups to the moms group, not remembering the name right at this point, but there are new groups forming that say, you know, this is the constituency that's not had a voice. How do we find the ability to organize with the knowledge of what those limitations are? So the mom, Rise Up Moms, and I'm just not, Mother Up, got it. You know, kids come to the meetings, because guess what? If you got a 2-year-old on your hip, you can't go places unless everyone says it's okay to bring kids, it's okay for the meeting to get disrupted by crying and diaper changes and all that. We have to think that not all meetings of importance have to be really staid and quiet. Let kids play in the back so parents with young children can participate. It's okay for there to be some noise. You look at cultures around the world, kids are a part of the process. In this country, kids are apart from the process from day one. So there's things like that that are going to change it over time. And as far as inviting others in, and I've got a few cards, not enough, but I actually met another lieutenant governor 2 years ago, and I was frustrated that I had not thought of it. Over 20 years of public service. And she gave me her card, and the second I took it, I said, I can't believe I have not been doing this the whole time I've had a business card as a public official. And so my card has Braille on. And I got to tell you, back to those moments when somebody says thank you, they don't even have to say thank you. I've only given about 5 or 6 people this card for whom they directly need the Braille. But the smile, their body language, the second they touch it, literally, the impact is profound. And I'm actually tearing up a little just now talking about it. And for the rest of you who don't need it, it actually still has a profound effect. It's inclusionary, it's accessibility, and it actually has made many other people think, I can't believe I don't do this. And so not a policy has been changed with this card, but the impact on politics and engagement has been. So we have to keep finding those things and be open to those opportunities.
All right, I'm going to move us along. Nope, that's all right. I'm going to move us along just so that students and visitors can get their questions answered. So let's go ahead.
The answer is yes.
Yes, I want to ask you, like, as a legislator, so like, have you encountered any controversial issue or legislation that you found to be ethically or socially debatable yourself? Like, has any of them like ever conflict with your personal belief? Like, for example, euthanasia is a very highly debated issue that has like both very strong and reasonable argument both for and against it. I don't know, like, what is your line of thinking when you are trying to reason yourself when passing those legislation?
There have been bills that in hindsight, there's not many thankfully, but there's a few where I had voted one way, and 20 years later I go, you know, knowing more and knowing what I know now, I would have voted the other way. So I voted against Act 60, one of the most progressive funding laws for education anywhere in the country. And I voted against it because it wasn't income-based enough. Okay? Now that was partly being one of a 3-member caucus whose job was to set a stake in the ground that this is where we're trying to get. And this isn't getting there, and someone's got to say we got to go farther. But in hindsight, that law has been one of the most fundamentally sound pieces of legislation for school funding that's ever existed in this country. That isn't necessarily an ethical difference, but as far as conflicting myself from where I once was. When it comes to issues of end of life, I don't know that I would support a euthanasia law. And that's a subtle difference on the wording, and I want to be delicate because I don't know your breadth of the language. Because euthanizing someone is doing it to them. And with end-of-life choices, it was you choose to have the prescription and you self-administer it. So there's a line there that I'm not sure I could cross. I would say probably the biggest ethical issue that I've had contortions about is actually vaccinations. And I have been soundly charged, and some people have said, I agree with you for 95% of what you do, but my standing up to say I didn't support, and voted against vaccinations being mandatory for children to be able to attend public schools. And as much as I spoke fairly strongly about it when I was speaking to it, I still am deeply conflicted.
Tell a little bit, because I was there that day when we took that vote, and I know that we weren't on the same page.
I was one of 4, I think.
Right.
So
but
most
tell us
people
a little bit about your, why.
Sure. So there's a couple things. Back to the world of hyperbole in politics. You're either support vaccinations or you are an anti-vaxxer, right? That's the language. And the reality, like everything, and some would argue some are more, there's a clear line, and others it's grayer. But there's always some gray to that line. And I am not in the anti-vaxxer camp that says thimerosal causes autism. And things that are in these are inherently evil, terrible, and bad, and the mercury in there is going to kill you. None of that is factually true, and I don't believe it. I was a chemistry major at one time. my concern around vaccinations in order for people to attend public school is a couple different things. One, public school is the fundamental economic justice opportunity in this country. And to deny that is fundamentally, as a progressive thinker on economics, a challenge, because it's the parents that are making the decision, not the child. So the child has no voice in their economic opportunity to go to school. Two, I know a number of families now, because they all called me after this topic was coming up, and they knew that I was open to this aspect of the conversation. There are a very small number of families where a child has a severe to even debilitating reaction. Just biologically, we're all different, and there's a very, very small number, like anything, we're allergic to different things and so forth, who have a severe reaction to a vaccine. And I happen to think that that family, therefore, has a slightly more likely proclivity for that for their next children. And we can easily attain herd immunity numbers with that number of people having that choice. So I would have rather we found a compromise somewhere in there. Now, some would argue doctors can give that choice. And therefore, they could offer that and sign off on that for that family. And that is the law still today. But doctors have come to the point where they don't give that choice even in those circumstances. These families have asked their doctors, and their doctors have said no. And if they had said yes, it would be a very, very small number, well below the threshold for still attaining herd immunity. But I am conflicted, because there are other children that can't go to public school or have life risk scenarios because of their immunity challenges if you don't have herd immunity. And you don't have that societally reduced risk of some of these diseases that most people would recover from, but those highly vulnerable, immunity compromised individuals are likely to die from. So it's an extremely difficult topic for me internally. I'm perpetually conflicted.
But I appreciate you sharing it. I mean, that was a hard day. I mean, I know you, just like you said, there were 4 of you who voted no, but I appreciate your willingness to share that with folks in your position, and perhaps it will lead to other questions.
And I'll add one last quick piece on that, which is it has been used politically against me. I mean, an ad 2 years ago was like, "You want to kill children." It was essentially the wording of the ad, along with me being a thief and other things. So apparently I'm lots of things. But
right back here,
it has implications.
Oh, yeah. I love that you addressed that you weren't, assuming that, autism is caused by, and things like that, which are the most controversial. But I was just wondering what you'd say to, like, if it wasn't mandatory, because I recognize the things that you said, if that leaves open a door for the families who do believe that vaccines cause autism, and that it is an autism is an epidemic, and almost also debate about like how it could be harming other children if some are vaccinated and some are not. So essentially, just on the note of like opening that door, so where and you said there's gray areas, but do you have any competitive?
Well, I think our job as a society, as leaders, whether it's politicians, scientists, or otherwise, is to continue to repeat the facts and continue to dispel that misinformation. And it's easy to do it by passing a law. It's hard to do it as a society with continued conversations. It's more work, but we shouldn't shy away from that more work. And the final piece I would say with respect to vaccinations is, while there are 12 or 14, I don't know the number right now, mandatory vaccinations, there are 260 plus vaccinations in the pipeline. Now, most of those are probably quite important to have. There are vaccinations being developed around Lyme disease, and my spouse is an 18-year sufferer of Lyme disease. So I'm well aware of the potential positive side, as well as the positive side that many of us have lived with without polio being rampant in our society and many other things. But back to corporate money and greed, I also have a side of me that doubts the intentions of some in the pharmaceutical industry, and that they will work to make sure many of these are mandatory, even if they are not quite as widespread a problem for the mighty dollar. And at some point, we are all impacted by the cumulative effect of what we put into our body, whether it's pollutants in the air we breathe, or the water we drink, or herbicides on the food. Because every single one of those herbicides has been approved by our scientists at the federal level, but we have more cancer. And the same, I fear, in the world of vaccines, that if everyone's getting 260, 300, 500, where does that stop with respect to what is that cumulative effect? And I don't know that answer from a scientific or factual perspective right now. But that's a seed of doubt for me with pharmaceutical industry in particular. Thank you, opioid crisis.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. In 2016 in North Carolina, a Democratic governor was elected, and the legislature began to move to strip him of power and things. And we see the same thing happening now in Wisconsin, where the legislatures are attempting to strip the governor of power and the secretary. And it seems our democracy is in trouble, not so much from the electorate, but from legislatures. And this partisan politics, I want to know if you see this trend continuing, because it seems like we're almost destroying the institutions.
That's right.
That give us democracy.
I am a perpetual optimist, and so far it's worked out well for me. But I actually think we will get through this. And I think, if to use a metaphor, if a tiger is backed into a corner, right, it's going to be the most violent and lash out the most as it gets boxed more and more and more into that corner. And I think what we're seeing and have seen over the last decade or two, and it's going to get, well, I think the worst was these past 2 years. We'll still see elements of it over this next decade. But the numbers are not on their side. And when we think about it, as I said earlier, one election at a time, or win or loss, one fight at a time, we will become disillusioned to the system and apathetic, and it doesn't matter. But in fact, if we do the most work now, in these next 10 years, and then hopefully where I have optimism is in youth turnout that happened this time. There was certainly a lot of effort to get young people engaged, but I got to tell you that in Vermont, there was no congressional race on the ballot that was going to tip Congress. In fact, I was nervous about my own election because even the governor's race, which got a decent amount of media, was not generating the type of groundswell of voter enthusiasm that 2 years ago we saw, not only because of the presidential election, but the governor's race was a $6 million race instead of $1.5 million to $2 million race as it was this time. And I thought, as a lieutenant governor, it doesn't actually generate the enthusiasm and energy to give people like, I got to go vote to make sure the lieutenant governor doesn't change. It just doesn't rise to the level, right? And yet we saw turnout in Vermont and in young people go up just the same. And back to the silver lining of this dark, dark cloud that we're in right now, the awakening of the importance of that participation. I think, unlike what happened with Obama, where it was a cult of personality in the moment, I think this is deeper. And if over these first of all, it's two-year cycles in a row as opposed to 4 years apart. And the Senate might even be 6 years, so it might be 2-2-2. That importance is going to ingrain that participation in a way that if young people continue to vote and expand their vote as they are, then that changes. That tiger in the corner is now caged in, or will be. And so they are lashing out and they are doing these things, but they are fixable things. We are better off in Wisconsin with a limited power Democratic governor than we were with the governor and that legislative chambers the way it was. We now have 7 more governorships across the country. There were 350 House and Senate seats. There were numerous trifectas that were broken up, trifecta meaning House, Senate, and governor. The redistricting in 2 years, the writing is on the wall. Not only are there still fewer Democratic governors, but population-wise, Democrats actually represent the majority of the people at the governor's office, which means redistricting issues will be helped in 2 years.
I was just wondering, you mentioned it earlier about how the word politician has become sort of a negative ring to it. And I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that and possibly talk about what has to be done to sort of remove that negative energy around the word.
I think a couple things. A portion of it is self-inflicted in that we get wrapped up in the hyperbole. A portion of it is media in that, and I'm not a, it's all fake news kind of person, don't get me wrong, but the media is highly constrained by the attention span of the consumer. And with the media now, what we have to do as a political figure, if I want my quote, which I don't want for me necessarily, but for the issue I care about, to get into the story, it's got to be pithy and biting and succinct. And most of us aren't that eloquent. We're mere humans. And a few people are phenomenal orators, but most politicians aren't. And so the way to get your quote in is to be a little more than everybody else. And we've been a little mooring and a little mooring and a little mooring and a little mooring to where it's only the most inflammatory thing that gets into the story. Because they still need someone to click or buy that paper or click on that link. And so it's happened by that sort of feedback loop. So you have to demand more. But fundamentally, the argument, and I'm sorry if this sounds partisan, I've probably said a couple other things that have too, but one party, their argument is that government is bad. Government is bad, 3 words. Easy argument to make. Defending what government does and its role in our lives and what it can do well and sometimes doesn't do well is complicated. And I would argue the other party speaks to that. Well, government is bad is a much easier message than it's complicated. And so we are at a structural disadvantage by being thinkers. And I'm sorry to say it that way. I think there are a lot of Republicans who are good thinkers, and we're in New England where fundamentally we actually have good thinkers at the table on all parties. But at the national level, money and greed has driven particularly the Republican Party to a point where they are speaking in simplistic ways that don't reflect the complexity. And part of that is to make government bad, and one way of making government bad is to make politicians bad. And if you want to see the fundamental effect on it, it was the election of 2 years ago, where over 30 years, over $1 billion has been spent to make you not like Hillary Clinton. That was not a 2-year election. That was when she was not even First Lady of Arkansas, the Republicans were attacking her to defeat Bill Clinton. And over 30 years, over $1 billion was spent to make you go, boy, she is really smart. She is really qualified, but there's something I don't like about her. Right? And that is the epitome of politicians are bad, even though she was fundamentally one of the most qualified, intelligent, prepared people who I disagree with on plenty of issues. But fundamentally one of the most prepared people to be president of this country of anybody who has ever run in the history of this country. But we didn't quite feel right about
ladies and gentlemen, because our Lieutenant Governor is going to be returning to his farm this evening, much to our disappointment, we would love for him to stay the night and have more time with us. I am going to wrap things up now so people have a few minutes to come down and talk with him. I know there are still some people, gives him an opportunity to maybe have a cup of coffee with people before he gets on the road. This has been an incredibly enlightening, honest, informative discussion, and I want to thank our Lieutenant Governor, David Zuckerman, for making the trip down here to be with us. Thank you. I just got a raise.
We do? We got to do this for a while. If we like this. Thank you. You don't have to stand, please.
Thank you. For those of you who are in this class, who are taking this as a class, please meet us around the corner, Design Lab 1. Next week is our final discussion. I hope the President Pro Tem of the Vermont State Senate is ready to try to beat what I thought was a lively, great discussion. So, thank you. Thanks, that was really great. It was really great. No, I was joking when I said I knew it was going to be